Good afternoon. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett with NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. You have joined the Using Energy Efficiency to Meet Peak Electricity Demand webinar, and we will get started in just 1 minute. Good afternoon. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett with NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. Welcome to the Innovation webinar for November 2019. NARUC runs a monthly webinar on innovation topics and on a Thursday each month from 4 o'clock Eastern. Today's webinar is Using Energy Efficiency to Meet Peak Electricity Demand, and we are grateful to have the wonderful lineup of panelists that you see on the screen in front of you. The webinar will be moderated by Wally Nixon, attorney at the Arkansas Public Service Commission, and I will turn it over to Wally to introduce the topic and speakers.
Thank you very much, Danielle. It's a pleasure to be able to do this. I work as a commissioner advisor to the commissioners here at the Arkansas Commission, where we've been doing energy efficiency programs for about 10 years at this point. And this topic is very interesting to me because I have long thought that there were demand response benefits of energy efficiency, even if you're not paying attention to that. And we do pay attention to it. And so I think our speakers will be very helpful in understanding this subject, and I will introduce them now and we will get started. First, Natalie Mims-Frick is an energy efficiency program manager in the electricity markets and policy group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. She conducts research and manages projects on energy efficiency, technical assistance, policy, program design, implementation, and evaluation. Next, Rachel Gold is the senior manager of the utilities program at the ACEEE, American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Rachel conducts research and provides technical assistance to states, utilities, and advocates on energy efficiency policy, utility regulation, and rate making and program design. And our third speaker is Angela Long, who is a planning manager in the customer solutions team at PacifiCorp. Angela is responsible for the planning and design of customer-focused energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed energy programs, pilots, and offerings across 6 states. And with that, I will turn it over to Natalie, who's going to go first.
That sounds great. Thanks, Wally. So my name is Natalie Mims-Frick, and I'm with LB&L. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Today, I'm going to present research from our recently released report, Peak Demand Impacts from Electricity Efficiency Programs, which is shown here. And I wanted to start by acknowledging my co-authors, and they're shown at the bottom of the slide, and also give you easy access to the link to the report and also to our infographic, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. If we can go on to the next slide. Today, I'm going to provide background on Berkeley Labs' cost of saving electricity work, discuss the approach for our cost of saving peak demand research. I'll talk about some of the results, specifically for states and by programs. And then I'll talk about our sensitivity analysis for climate zone and peak periods. And I'll wrap up with next steps. So we can go to the next slide. So the blue box on the left side of the slide shows the cost of saving electricity, and it's expressed in dollars per kWh, and the cost of saving peak demand is expressed in dollars per kW. And for this study, we calculated the program administrator cost of saving electricity and peak demand, which means that the money that a participant would pay for an efficiency measure isn't included. So thus, these metrics are from a utility system perspective. And we gather the cost and savings data from annual utility filings, such as EM&D reports. For context, I wanted to highlight some of the reasons why cost of saving electricity or peak demand metrics are important. So first, they can be used to help ensure electricity system reliability at the most affordable cost as part of resource adequacy planning and implementation activities particularly as electricity systems are rapidly changing. Other reasons include understanding the impact of efficiency on load forecasts, benchmarking, screening electricity resources, and evaluating how program costs may change over time. Next slide, please. Currently, we have 11 LB&L publications on the cost of saving electricity or peak demand. And I forgot to include the link for them, so you can either email me or just Google cost of saving electricity LB&L, and they'll pop up at the landing page. But in gathering data for these 11 different studies, we have more than 13,000 program years of data in our database. We have data on investor-owned utilities from 116 program administrators in 41 states, which is the map that's shown in the top right corner of the slide. And we have data from 111 publicly owned utility program administrators in 14 states, which is the map in the bottom right side of the slide. And for these studies, we collect the energy and now the peak demand savings, program costs, and then other information like measure lifetimes, participants, net savings. And we also have a updated cost of saving natural gas report that's forthcoming. So look for that if that's something of interest to you. We can go on to the next slide. So with that context, I'm going to turn to our main attraction, which is this new cost of saving peak demand report. It's a first of a kind analysis, and it explores questions such as, are utilities reporting information on peak demand reductions from efficiency? And how do utilities or program administrators define or calculate peak demand for their efficiency programs? And what's the cost of saving peak demand for the utility portfolios and for states? And this image is an excerpt from our infographic, and it shows the states that we used for this analysis, and then the cost of saving peak demand for each one of them. And then there's a similar one that has the cost of saving electricity. And then again, there's the links for the report and the infographic at the bottom of the slide. If we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so our approach for gathering the data for the cost of saving peak demand, we collected data from 36 program administrators in 9 different states, which I have listed here, and it's for 2014 through 2017. And these states represented 43 to 49% of the national annual efficiency spending. We gathered data on program type, program costs, savings by program, both KWH and KW, and summer and winter KW were included if they were listed. Massachusetts was our only state that explicitly had winter peak savings. We calculated the savings weighted average cost of saving peak demand and cost of saving electricity. The cost of saving electricity is levelized over the lifetime of the program, and the cost of saving peak demand is for the first year savings only. So, and we did that to reduce the complexity of this analysis because it was the first time we were doing it, but we may change that in the future. So it's also important to note that these metrics have to be considered separately because both of them use all of the program costs. So we took all of the program costs, divided it by the electricity for cost of saving electricity, all of the program costs divided by demand for cost of saving peak demand. Finally, we conducted 2 sensitivity analyses to see if climate and the duration of the peak period affect the cost of saving peak demand. Okay, next slide. This is a map of our states that we gathered data for. In each one of these little text boxes, there's a climate zone listed that we used for our sensitivity analysis, as well as the peak hours, and I'll talk about that more in a few slides. And then the ISO RTOs are listed because we wanted to have geographic diversity in the states we were selecting and have several wholesale markets represented, so those are listed there. Next slide, please. So getting into the results, this table shows the cost of saving peak demand and the cost of saving electricity for each one of the states that we gathered data in. And the first year savings weighted program administrator cost of saving peak demand average, which is the bottom line on this table, was $1,483 per kW, and it varies by more than 4-fold, so from $568 all the way to $2,353 per kW. The lifetime savings weighted program administrator cost of saving electricity for this study period was between 2.9 cents per kWh, or excuse me, the average was 2.9 cents per kWh, and it varies by a factor of 3, so from about 1.3 to about 4 cents per kWh across all of our 9 states. And comparing the range in values for these two metrics illustrates that program costs are the primary driver of the differences in the cost of saving peak demand across the states, although the level of peak demand savings also appears to have some impact as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows the relationship we found between the cost of saving electricity and the cost of saving peak demand by state. The x-axis is the levelized cost of saving electricity, and the y-axis is the cost of saving peak demand. Each state that we used has its own color, and each dot is 1 year of data. So the annual cost of saving electricity and cost of saving peak demand values are pretty closely clustered for several states, such as Arizona, Colorado, Massachusetts, and Texas. And that's a logical result if the program budgets are relatively stable and the program administrators are experienced, or the mix of programs doesn't change dramatically. Next slide, please. So starting to dig in a little bit deeper, after we calculated the cost of saving peak demand for states, we started looking at programs. So we looked at 7 programs, and these programs represent about 58% of the peak demand savings for the 36 utilities that we looked at. And similar to our cost of saving electricity results, residential lighting is the lowest cost resource for peak demand savings at $733 per kW. And prescriptive rebates that target medium and large commercial and industrial customers, the second row, is the second most expensive or least expensive one at $13.31 per kW. And then in the middle, we have several programs that have comparable program savings, weighted average and median values for cost of saving peak demand, so around $2,000 to $2,500 per kW. And then we move down into our more expensive programs, which are the C&I custom rebate and the low income. The results are a little bit more difficult to explain for commercial and industrial custom rebate programs. The savings weighted average cost of saving peak demand is almost 50% higher than the median. And our hypothesis with that is that the programs are heterogeneous, and the programs span HVAC equipment and controls for commercial customers all the way to process improvements for industrial customers. So this diverse mix of measures may be one of the reasons why we have different values for the cost of saving peak demand. For low income, those results are also a little bit difficult to interpret. There's pretty big difference between cost of saving peak demand median and savings weighted averages in those first 2 columns. And it could be because the cost of the programs is simply high, which is reflected in the cost of saving electricity. But it could also be because we're doing savings weighted averages, and California utilities administer pretty large low income programs that have a lot of spending and moderate savings. So that could be the reason that the savings weighted values are so much higher. Next slide, please. So moving on further to our sensitivity analysis, this was the climate zone map that we used to divide up the utilities into each one of their climate zones. We wanted to test this hypothesis that programs with weather-dependent measures would have a lower cost of saving peak demand in more extreme climates. So next slide, please. This chart shows, I'm going to talk about 2 programs that we looked at. I have slides for 3, but I won't have time to talk through all of them. So this chart shows the relationship we found between the cost of saving electricity and the cost of saving peak demand for 5 climate zones when we were looking at a non-weather sensitive program, which is residential lighting. So as with the earlier chart, the x-axis is the levelized cost of saving electricity, and the y-axis is cost of saving peak demand. The 5 colors are the 5 different climate zones that we're representing, and each dot represents a program year of data. So more than 80% of these programs have a savings weighted cost of saving peak demand of less than $1,000 per kW, and a cost of saving electricity of less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So not surprisingly, these results occur somewhat independently of climate zones. For example, program administrators in mixed and humid climates like Maryland and New York reported some of the lowest cost of saving peak demand values, between 300 and 750 per kW, even though there are fewer cooling degree days than in warm and humid climate zones like Texas and Arkansas. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the next slide and go to the one after that, which is residential HVAC. Perfect, thank you. This is my final example of climate sensitivity, of our climate sensitivity analysis. So this is showing the relationship between cost of saving electricity and cost of saving peak demand for residential HVAC, which is weather sensitive. And there's a high coincidence factor for a lot of these HVAC programs, meaning that the savings are occurring during the system peak. But they still tend to be relatively expensive, with a median cost of saving peak demand of $2,200 per kW. And we found that for this analysis, the cost of saving peak demand tends to be much higher in cool and humid climates, such as Illinois, Massachusetts, central and western New York, as compared to warm and humid climates such as Arizona and parts of Texas and Northern California. So our results suggest that the cost of saving peak demand is both influenced by the program design and the climate where the program's happening. Next slide, please. The second sensitivity analysis that we did was on the duration of peak period. We wanted to explore whether the duration of the peak period influences the cost of saving peak demand. And in order to do that, we grouped the states together into these three different groups: 256 hours, 498 hours, and then everybody else, basically. And in order to create those groupings, we reviewed approaches that utilities and regional grid operators use to define peak periods and methods to estimate savings. And we found that there was missing data on peak period savings, there was different definitions of peak periods, there was inconsistent reporting, varying methods for calculating peak demand savings. And so all of these factors made it really difficult for us to consider how the duration of the peak period might influence the cost of saving peak demand. Next slide, please. And this is what the results for that analysis looked like, and it looks very similar to the residential HVAC slide that we looked at just a few slides ago. And what we ultimately found was that the grouping utilities by their definition of peak period doesn't provide much insight and doesn't really add more value beyond grouping the utilities by climate zone. And it was outside the scope of this particular study to further investigate the methods that we use to calculate peak demand savings, or excuse me, that the utilities and program administrators use. But we definitely recommended that as an area of future research, which is a good segue to my next slide, which should be on next steps. Yep, and so what we found overall with the study was that the cost of saving peak demand on average was $1,483 per kW. And we concluded that's a relatively low-cost way to meet peak demand as compared to capital costs of other resources. And right now we're conducting additional research on this, and we're updating our data from our original 9 states that were part of this analysis. We're adding in some new states to broaden our national coverage. We'll be conducting a qualitative analysis, talking to utilities and program administrators about how they calculate their peak demand savings, what they use the peak demand savings for, information about their coincidence factors, things like that. And we may explore other types of analysis, such as the lifetime peak demand savings, creating a template for peak demand costs to try and get more uniformity across all of the different states. We may look at winter peak demand savings or peak to energy ratios in our ongoing work. So that is all that I had to say. I think the next slide has my email, so feel free to reach out to me if you'd like. And then the slide after that is just an appendix, and it shows the information about the peak demand definitions. There's lots more information in the report about all of this. So this is really just a teaser to get you to click on one of those links to the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Let's move on now and hear from our next speaker, Rachel Gold.
There's one, excuse me, this is Danielle. There was one clarifying question for Natalie, if we could, just very briefly. Natalie, a question came through via chat that says, on slide 15, for the cost of saving electricity and peak demand, did you consider behavioral interventions such as home energy reports?
I do not remember off the top of my head if we collected. We collected data on any program that had a peak demand savings associated with it in the utility or program administrator reporting. For the 7 programs, the subset of programs that we focused on, I think that those were the programs that had the most utilities that offered those programs and also reported peak demand savings. I'm sure that some utilities do have peak demand savings from behavioral programs, but we didn't analyze them as part of this project.
Thank you.
I think that answered the question, unless it was more focused on the behavioral impacts of how that would influence the savings, which we also didn't look at.
I think that takes care of the clarification that was requested. Thank you. Please continue.
All right. Rachel, you're up.
All right, thanks, Wally, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Really excited to talk about this topic of how energy efficiency can help meet peak demand. It's something that's really been coming up a lot lately, and I think driven by increasing peaks relative to average, and driven by the increasing penetration of variable resources that require us to think about, even more so than we have in the past, the value of peak demand from all of the resources that are a part of our mix. So next slide. Today I'm going to talk about 2 areas. One is programs and the other is policy. On the program side, as Natalie illustrated, energy efficiency programs on their own can offer a potentially cost-effective means of addressing peak demand. Those energy efficiency programs can shape the load to reduce system needs at peak times. In addition, there are opportunities to combine energy efficiency and demand response to deliver that programs that offer a lowering of the overall load, but also some controllable demand reduction. And so I'll share our recent research led by my colleagues Dan York, Grace Ralph, and Corey Waters on integrated energy efficiency and demand response programs. I'll share about why they're important, what sort of enabling technologies are a part of these programs, and what we found in our research when we dug into their prevalence around the country and what's in the way of them expanding. I'll also share some research about the policy side. So we have taken a look at energy efficiency resource standards and the goals, and have some information about how that relates to peak demand. And we'll also talk about some of the other policy tools that regulators and utilities have available to encourage energy efficiency that delivers demand reductions. So next slide. Oh, actually 2 slides. Thank you. Wonderful. So I'll tell you a little bit about our integrated energy efficiency demand response research first. The goal of this research was to really characterize what's the landscape of integrated programs around the country, what utilities are offering these programs, and what can we learn from the existing set of programs. We know and have known for a long time from research from LB&L and us and others that there really is an opportunity to combine energy efficiency and demand response in a supportive way, but we had the hypothesis that there were limited examples, and so we wanted to investigate what was out there. Next slide. So to start off with, we surveyed and had a number of conversations with experts to identify what the potential benefits of integration might be. Did a bit of a literature review there to identify, okay, what are the potential benefits if we integrate energy efficiency and demand response programs? Then we looked at actual cases that we did later in the research to see which benefits were more or less commonly realized. So we'll get into the methodology of how we collected all that information, but just at a high level, I thought it would be helpful to start with, well, why would we do this in the first place? What are the benefits of integration? Some of the most commonly realized benefits from integrating efficiency and demand response were things like bill savings, program satisfaction, customer satisfaction, lower program costs from combined administration. Some of the ones that we saw in a few cases, but less commonly, were things like increased resource adequacy. In some places that was quantified, earnings opportunities for shareholder incentives. On the other hand, things like availability of ancillary services or affecting wholesale competition, those were not things that we saw very much in our research. Next slide, please. So this shares just a little bit about, as we took a look at the cases around the country, what were some of the technologies that we heard as being critical to enable energy efficiency and demand response together. And so on the residential side, there were sort of a wide range of different technologies that came up in our conversations. Smart and Wi-Fi enabled thermostats was probably the most common, recognizing that is getting pretty prevalent, and that those thermostats can offer the opportunity for energy efficiency as well as the opportunity for utility control, including things like pre-cooling for a demand response event. Advanced metering infrastructure presents an opportunity to support integration, although on its own it doesn't create integration. It's something that can be leveraged. It's again, infrastructure to support integrated programs with things like pay for performance, time-based pricing. AMI can help to make those things work better. Direct load control switches and mobile apps and online marketplaces also came up as helpful enabling technologies to combine programs. On the commercial side, we really found that it was typically a mix of three things that led to an integrated program: a central control system, a building energy management system, equipment with embedded controls within it, as well as smart components, things like sensors or smart plugs. Next slide, please. So in our research, we categorized what we found, all of the different programs from our survey, into 4 levels of integration. And we found the first level was just recognition. And this is something that's sort of a nice first step for utilities, which is offering a program where there are capabilities to go from energy efficiency demand response or vice versa, but they haven't yet deployed it. A great example is Duke Carolinas and Duke Progress offer a business program that has HVAC cycling. Right now it's a demand response program, but it has embedded energy efficiency savings, and it sounds like they intend on eventually getting it to be an integrated program. Second level is cross promotion, basically just marketing one program with another, or sort of integrating aspects of outreach or education for the 2 programs. Administrative coordination is when there's a single point of contact across multiple programs or coordinated internal management, sometimes simultaneous program enrollment, but the program's not yet a fully integrated program. That's our sort of last level, where it's a single program offering both energy efficiency and demand response. A good example is NV Energy offers their PowerShift commercial energy services, which is a single program for rebates for efficiency equipment, assessments, smart thermostats, and all of those can be enrolled for demand response. So there's sort of an integration within the program. Next slide. So our research took a look at the 52 largest electric utilities by sales. We were able to find 44 utility filings for those 52 that were current as of the year we were looking at, 2017. And of those, we only found 5 programs at that highest level of integration of a fully integrated program. Many more programs, though, that have some degree of integration that utilities can build on. And we found really that smart thermostats were particularly prevalent and are perhaps a gateway to integration because they're sort of a relatively easy measure to integrate on the residential side, and it can build the capacity inside a utility to offer an integrated program. Next slide. I'll quickly jump through this and note that there are quite a few challenges or barriers in the way of offering integrated programs. Those are both from the regulatory context, a lack of standard practices for evaluating integrated programs from a cost effectiveness perspective. Also, targets that are separate, perhaps with separate budgets in separate proceedings, and that can create challenges from a management perspective to integrate these. Similarly, we found that on the utility side, there was a struggle to integrate work streams or budgets, a struggle to figure out how to coordinate with contractors and with customers to create a value proposition for an integrated program. Next slide. So takeaways for this particular piece of research: although there are not that many integrated programs, there really is technology and customer demand that's driving interest from utilities. We found that residential smart thermostat programs were most prevalent, but there are other examples in the commercial sector. And in terms of opportunities, we heard 3 big things. One is to really focus on customers and trade allies and figuring out what's a good value proposition to offer an integrated program? You know, you're asking customers to do something for the grid when you do demand response. When you do energy efficiency, you're offering something to customers. And so there's a nice opportunity to create a compelling value proposition that combines those two things. There's a real opportunity to better leverage existing data and partnerships, the AMI data that many utilities now have, the partnerships that they have with their contractors and others. And lastly, there is some work that can be done on the policy side to create some supportive policies to reduce some of the barriers to integration. All right, next I will jump into policy tools to encourage peak demand reduction from energy efficiency. And next slide. So I'll start with the goals. So these are energy efficiency resource standards, or EARS, which are the energy efficiency cousin to the renewable portfolio standard. We now have about, I believe, 26 states with electric goals, and 19 states with a energy efficiency resource standard for natural gas. And these have typically been built around direct reductions in energy efficiency. But we're seeing an evolution, next slide please, in what's being asked of the energy efficiency programs that utilities or program administrators run. We're finding that with reduced savings from lighting, as we successfully move up the adoption curve there, there's a question about, well, what's next? What are the other options that we have? The cost of controls and flexibility has gone way down, which is creating some opportunities. We're also seeing decreasing average avoided costs at the same time as, in some places, increasing peak avoided costs. So there's sort of a disconnect happening between what's happening at the peak and over the average. And we're also seeing an interest in electrification, in shifting some end uses from fossil fuels to electricity, which can have some impacts on the grid because we're adding loads. And we're also seeing changing policy priorities, making sure that we're thinking about things like cost and affordability, both overall and in terms of equity implications. Grid value and decarbonization are all came up in our research as being some of the drivers for changes to energy efficiency resource policies. So this summer, my colleagues Annie Gilio, Westenberg, and I published a paper, which we'll have a link to, that took a look at how states are evolving their energy efficiency resource standards in light of all of these changing market conditions and policy priorities. And next slide, I'll just highlight what this looks like specifically related to demand reduction. So we took a look at how goals were evolving with respect to electrification and decarbonization, with respect to equity, but some of the changes that we're seeing do specifically relate to demand reduction, making sure that the energy efficiency we get is energy efficiency that's valuable both for reductions overall and for reductions at peak. In Massachusetts, they have a multiple goals structure, so they have a set of goals, a basket of goals that the program administrators need to meet. And their most recent portfolio developed a goal for active demand management, separate and distinct from traditional energy efficiency, with summer and winter peak demand savings. In Hawaii, there's a high penetration of renewables, as many of you know, and an increasing desire for energy efficiency investments to provide further time and location specific value to the grid. They have a peak demand savings goal for their program administrator now, and are considering what would it look like to have a lifetime peak demand metric? What would it look like to have a grid services ready metric? So that's under consideration there. In Minnesota, fuel switching is currently prohibited under a 2005 Department of Commerce order, and advocates, utilities, and others have been working on a legislative proposal that would lift that prohibition to enable fuel switching, efficient fuel switching. And one of the criteria that they considered in Minnesota for what would it mean to be efficient fuel switching is that the measures do not increase utility system peak demand or require significant new investment. So Minnesota is explicitly building a consideration of peak demand into its its consideration of electrification. So that passed the House, but not the Senate. But I think there's ongoing work with the Department of Commerce to figure out how to enable efficient fuel switching there. Next slide. So I talked a lot about goals, and goals are really important, but there is a whole bevy of other tools available to regulators and to policymakers, everything from program design, fine-tuning customer incentives and offering what the New York Public Service Commission did, a quote kicker for measures that address specific grid needs, to adjusting cost effectiveness rules to make sure that the value is based on time and location. There's a lot of options available. The last one on this list I'll just highlight is performance incentives. So in over 20 states, utilities have performance-based incentives for their performance on delivering energy efficiency for customers. And last slide. We're doing some work right now with the folks over at Energy Innovation to take a look at performance incentive mechanisms for what we're calling strategic demand reduction. So energy efficiency and demand response, storage, all the different kinds of demand response that are targeted at minimizing system costs by displacing the need for services traditionally provided by the supply side. So this is very preliminary, and we'll be excited to share it with you all in a couple of months. But so far, we've found 13 examples of demand reduction performance incentives in place across the country. There's a bunch of flavors of that, which we'll get into in that paper, but I just wanted to tease that because we'll be sharing that research soon. And last slide. I'll just say thank you for listening. Lots of research just thrown at you, and there's a lot more details in the publications listed here. If anyone on the line is a utility interested in these issues, we do have a Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group where we bring utilities together in peer conversations around this very topic of how do we integrate energy efficiency and demand response. And so eager to hear from folks who are interested in that topic. I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
We don't have anything coming through the chat box.
Okay, great.
Well, if there are no clarifying questions, let's move to Angela and hear about PacifiCorp.
Hi, thank you. Let's go to my first slide. There we go. Sorry, go to the next slide. Okay, so like Wally said earlier, my name is Angela Long. I am a planning manager at PacifiCorp. For those of you that don't know us, we actually are a Berkshire Hathaway company. PacifiCorp has 2 operating units, Rocky Mountain Power and Pacific Power, across 6 states, and we have transmission lines across 10 states. This is an important detail for my slide because when we think of energy efficiency, we think of it at a system level, and I know that's slightly different from how other utilities may think about it. If you can go to my next slide, please. So our traditional process for energy efficiency has really been developing a conservation potential assessment, which looks at the technical achievable potential of energy efficiency and demand response. And that analysis gets bundled up by cost. And we do, in our IRP, convert the energy savings into some capacity bundles, but they're very high level in terms of it's just a capacity value for a mix of measures within a cost bundle. We have 26 cost bundles by state. It's not granular and it doesn't necessarily give energy efficiency a capacity value for program planning. So what we're doing here is slightly different, where we are trying to take energy efficiency and provide a more granular value for it in the context of program planning, and possibly even in the context of our IRP. Our energy efficiency competes within our IRP against other supply side resources, and so we're looking at various ways to value that energy efficiency in terms of capacity bundles and things like that. Next slide. So the first step of our analysis to really look at energy efficiency's ability to be a capacity resource was to determine what our use case is. Since we've typically looked at energy efficiency from a system level, we wanted to look at it more granularly at a state level all the way down to a feeder level. Our data sets aren't fully robust in that we do not have AMI, and for all of our customers, and our billing data only calculates capacity for each customer if they're billed for that capacity. So there was some data sets that we needed to provide clarity to. So our first step was really to look at each customer, define what we think their peak is, come up with some baseline assumptions for all of our states, all of our feeders, to be able to start building out what we will use to evaluate the impacts of energy efficiency at a locational level. Next slide. So the way that we started off with our capacity value was to develop a peak factor, which is really just utilizing our specific end-use load shapes. We have end-use load shapes by state, about 100 of them. So they're by state, by sector, and then by end use. We've defined a peak period, which could be different for each of our states and each of our feeders. And by using that peak period, we then came up with our peak factor by taking the hours during the peak plus the first hour, the hour before and the hour after, and just coming up with the average. Once we had that peak factor, we're able to multiply it to the annual energy savings and come up with what we think that capacity value is. So basically that demand reduction at the time of our defined peak period. Next slide. So once we had our peak factors by measure, we were able to take our program data and take our program actuals, apply the peak factor to that, and come up with a demand reduction for each measure that we've paid for. We were able to take those results and stack them on top of each other by sector and by end use. So as you see in the graph here, we have our impacts by end use and sector. We then took those program results and overlaid them against our peak period to see, were we actually reducing peak during that defined period. We had a very general goal of peak demand reduction that we wanted to achieve. And it was defined loosely as a season, but not a specific time. We want to move to the phase where we're actually looking at energy efficiency measures that can contribute to demand reduction during peak time. So building out a tool that helped us do that was really important. And one of the things that I want to mention here on this slide is that once determining the peak factor was somewhat easy. It was a mathematical equation. What's difficult is once you have that peak factor and you apply it to program results, your program results may not necessarily make sense. So if you see in my illustrative graph here for residential megawatts, once we applied our peak factor to our residential results, we had quite a few measures that fit into a miscellaneous load shape, things like plug loads, and appliances. We didn't have maybe a granular load shape for them, so all of our results looked kind of odd. So we're still in the process of trying to define and refine those results to get better data. And so this is really just a first step in our process, and we're going to continue to try to look at what type of data sets and resources we have to get better information along the way. And last slide. So this entire project of taking energy efficiency and evaluating it as a peak or as a capacity resource really came out of a process that we had internally where we were looking at transmission distribution projects and evaluating those traditional solutions against DERs. So typically in our process, if we had the need to upgrade a substation, we would look at non-wires alternatives. Energy efficiency was included in that, or I'm sorry, demand response was included in that, but energy efficiency wasn't. We wanted to look to see if we could actually take energy efficiency and use it as a capacity resource. So we partnered with Energy Trust of Oregon, who is our statewide implementer in Oregon, to look at could we quickly deploy energy efficiency in an area. And the word quick is important there because when we look at energy efficiency as a resource, we need to be able to do that very quickly if there is a peak time that we have a need in the future years. So we were really looking, I think we've traditionally looked at energy efficiency and its long-term benefits, but not necessarily its quick time frame of benefits. So when we deployed energy efficiency resources in this particular area, we didn't try to match up the resource mix to the actual peak. We just tried to see if energy efficiency could reduce demand. And so we had a loose target at the time, which was to see if energy efficiency could get around 460 kW during the summer period. We found that we were able to achieve that result. However, a couple things that we learned about energy efficiency is if you don't deploy it really quickly, if you have a need to solve some sort of issue, other things can happen. So we had a couple situations where we had a ton of new load that came on. We had large customers that had fires and their load came off. So we had a lot of lessons learned. We're doing a second pilot to test whether or not we could deploy faster. We can adjust our energy efficiency measures to really stack well onto that peak time. We're going to try to track costs better and refine the data as we go along. But I think the results from the Energy Trust of Oregon pilot are pretty promising in that energy efficiency does have the ability to be a capacity resource and be able to contribute as other measures like demand response are able to. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Yes, do we have any clarifying questions or other questions for Angela? And if not, we can open it up to general questions. Yes.
We have one clarifying question for Angela, and then when we're ready to move on, we've got one back for Natalie and a few others coming in. So Angela, does PacifiCorp plan to install AMI to have better granularity, or does this type of analysis seem to obviate the need for an AMI investment?
So we are actually installing AMI and have completed our AMI deployment in our Oregon and California states, and now we're moving on to our other states. So we will look to see if we can use AMI to help us with those states that have it to get better data. And I would say, yes, one of the learnings here is that AMI data would be very useful to have.
Yeah, certainly sounded like it. One more clarification question for Angela. Somebody said it looks like commercial sector got the bulk of the incentives. Can you clarify on how?
Yeah, that's actually a really good observation. So in this particular project, we had a large degree, most of the load was C&I based. And so this actually example that I showed was at a feeder level. I think that there was about 3,000 customers total on that feeder line. But the majority of the load for peak was being driven by commercial and industrial customers.
Great, thank you. And last clarifying question, and then we'll can get broader. It said on your last slide, Angela, the total cost per kWh is calculated by roughly dividing annual kWh divided by total incentives, which comes to about 14 cents. Is this a good way to interpret your results?
So the data set that we're looking at here is program data from Energy Trust of Oregon, not from our any of our other states where we actually implement energy efficiency programs. I think that that is a simple way of looking at it, but I would love to look at it from a levelized cost perspective. I think that that especially because in how we view energy efficiency in the context of our IRP as a resource that competes, that would be a better measurement of whether or not it's economic or cost effective to use energy efficiency as a capacity resource. So I guess my response would be it really depends on how you intend to use the data.
Thank you. Wally, there are a number of other questions, but if you would like to ask any first, certainly can start there.
On mute. I'm still on mute, but not now. A couple of questions that had come up for me. If any of you can address this, have you captured any data regarding whether these programs are rate-based or expensed? I can imagine if they're larger demand response types of programs. We've had one here in Arkansas for years, which is agricultural pumping in rice fields. And there the utility asked and was approved for rate basing it and earning a return. And they also do some DR in the smart thermostat world where I think it would be expensed as an energy efficiency program. So that's one question I have, whether that is something that you've looked at.
Hey, Wally, this is Rachel. I'll jump in to say that we took a look at, on the energy efficiency side, the energy efficiency performance incentive mechanisms and how they're structured across the country last December. And as of that time, almost all of the states that were incentivizing energy efficiency through some sort of shareholder incentive were doing it through expensing and then a separate shareholder incentive. There were, I believe, 5 or 6 states that allowed some sort of amortization and rate basing, but it's much less common on the energy efficiency side. I will note that there are a number of states, particularly in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic recently, where we've seen utilities requesting that. So it may be something that's on the rise, trying to make energy efficiency look comparable to other types of investments. But over the past, let's say, 10 years of energy efficiency growth, mostly it's been happening through expensing.
Okay. I think that's the only question I really have right now. We can open it up to others.
Excuse me. Okay, sure. We had a question for, 2 questions for Natalie. One, Natalie, somebody said we're in Washington State. Given data parsing by climate zone, how might we take lessons away from the analysis that you shared? Have any initial thoughts offhand?
For Washington, I mean, I think that the results I think broadly looking at the cost of saving electricity and the cost of saving peak demand for the different regions for the programs is interesting, even if it's not specific to your state, because it gives you a sense of the range of costs associated with the different program types across all of the climate zones that we looked at. I don't know that there's any specific program takeaways for Washington because we didn't spend a lot of time looking at winter peaking programs because we didn't have a lot of data on that. So I guess, that was this is the first of its kind study. So we're starting to dig in deeper, and it was really just our initial look at what data is out there and how we can use it and who's recording it and things like that. So I think there's a lot of takeaways from the report that are useful in terms of reporting and thinking about what the peak demand reductions from your programs are, but I don't know if there's anything like specific that says that in Washington you should do program X because it's going to result in the best ratio of cost of saving electricity and cost of saving peak demand.
Fair enough. Thank you. Natalie, we also had another question about how EE used to produce demand response could work in markets. The question says, there seems to be a problem with baselines in this approach. If energy efficiency is used to produce demand response, most energy markets require the resource to be there before the event. What are your thoughts? So these are only energy efficiency programs. These aren't any demand response programs. So and that's the reason that we put 100% of the costs into each one of these calculations, because
basically, you could take either one of those columns in that slide that shows the cost of saving electricity and the cost of saving peak demand, either by program or state, and put 0, because we're attributing all of the cost to either one of these metrics. So you could say that you're getting these peak demand savings from your efficiency programs and that the cost of saving electricity is 0, or you could say that you're getting the demand reductions for free and they're coming from your efficiency program. So we didn't look at how these savings could be packaged as a demand response offering, because we were just looking at what are the demand reductions from energy efficiency only programs, how are they being recorded, and how much does it cost? And so I don't have an immediate answer for how they could be bundled up or an answer to the baseline question, because our focus really was just on efficiency. Moving forward, we might start to collect or continue to collect demand response programs, the costs and savings associated with those, but the utility filings that have the demand response programs are a very small subsect of the demand response portfolio. So I don't know that that's going to fully capture that question either.
Thank you very much. One last question for Natalie, and then I have a couple for the whole group. Natalie, did you find the cost of savings were dependent on the total relative size of the EE programs in each state?
I think that the overall size of the programs and the overall expenditures there's definitely a close linkage between the cost of saving electricity and the cost of saving peak demand, which makes sense. There were some programs that saved more peak demand than we thought they would, so there was a few surprises along the way. Low income, even though it had a very high cost of saving peak demand, had more savings than what we anticipated we'd find. And other programs didn't have savings as high as we thought we'd find. So it was, it's a function of both the total program cost and the savings associated with it that starts to get into the peak demand calculations and where they're coming from and how robust they are. And I think that historically speaking, the cost of just peak demand savings from efficiency programs haven't been well recorded in annual utility filings or whatever documentation gets provided to regulators, because the annual efficiency savings for efficiency programs has been the focus, the energy savings. And so this is kind of the side piece of information that isn't even provided for all of the programs in a portfolio sometimes. So I think, it will be interesting as we continue to move this analysis forward to see if there is more robust data around demand savings and how it changes over time as we start to get more information and more data points to work with. But certainly the magnitude of spending is certainly an indicator, coupled with the savings.
Thank you very much. The next question probably should start with Angela, but anyone is invited to comment. Question for the speakers. Have you considered what role AMI or smart meter infrastructure has to play in this space around demand response? For example, in Massachusetts, had one of the highest avoided costs per kW, but has no AMI.
I think that the first thing that comes to mind to me, this is Angela, with AMI is the ability to really understand the AMI data. It's one thing to have the meter, but if you don't have a way to really aggregate that data or disaggregate it in a way that's informative, it's not exactly useful. But if you do have that ability, I think it gives energy efficiency the ability to become a DR-enabled resource. So you can partner that energy efficiency resource like heat pumps or smart thermostats to do other things, and that would really bring down the cost and help reduce demand as things shift. So even if you're planning for maybe one system-wide peak, you could actually shift that peak pretty easily when weather might change or you might have an unexpected weather event. So I think it gives you that insight and availability. And I'll open it up to the other speakers to talk to.
Hey, this is Rachel. I'll note that we're actually in the process right now at ACEEE of doing a bit of research on how program administrators can better leverage AMI where they have it. We found that in many cases, utilities that have AMI have primarily started their focus with the operational benefits rather than some of the customer enabling benefits like energy efficiency and demand response. And so we're in the process of doing that research right now. And our initial findings are that there is a lot of potential use cases to better leverage AMI where utilities have it, particularly in service of getting peak demand reductions from energy efficiency. And that's both on the customer-facing side, so doing a better job of giving direct feedback around information about energy usage and building in pricing feedback with things like peak time rebates or critical peak pricing. But it's also on the utility side. So like Angela said, having a better sense of what the demand reductions could be or need to be, but also using AMI data to target which customers are most likely to participate or benefit from the programs is another opportunity from AMI data.
Thank you. That's great to let people know about. We have only one more minute. Wally, do you have a preferred final question? We still have a number here too. So it is 4 o'clock, it's the top of the hour. We have about 4 or 5 additional questions. We'll send those to the presenters and see if we can't get some answers from them by email, and then can get back to the folks who submitted the questions. But thank you all so much for your engagement and sharing all of these very insightful questions for our speakers, and to our speakers for sharing their great answers to support us. Wally, is there anything you would like to say to close us out?
No, just thanks to everyone for attending and participating.
Excellent. This webinar slides and recording will be posted on NARUC's website. You should have received that link in the chat box, and we look forward to seeing folks on the webinar next month in December. Thank you very much.
Thank you.